The federal government tabled its budget on Tuesday. The parliamentary budget officer was anticipating a deficit of around $41 billion, and apparently it won't be balanced for a number of years. Now, to chat about this budget in more detail is political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, when it came to the budget, the federal government openly shared what would be in the budget over the past week or so. Were there any surprises left?
Surprises on both the spending and the taxation side. We know this is a big spending government. They always put out projections, oh, we'll spend this much, and then they overshoot it. They spend more and more each year. Program spending is up $30 billion over last year. Last year, program expenses were $450 billion. This year, they're $480 billion. The deficit is going to be $25 billion more than they projected in last year's budget over the coming 5 years. They're just, instead of the budget deficit going down, it's going back up again. And then you've got the interest charges on the deficit. This is the one I always say, it's like paying just a monthly minimum on your credit card. $54 billion this year. That's more than the federal government sends to the provinces and territories for healthcare. And it's more than they collect in the GST, Hal. So that's the spending side. It's crazy. They claim they're going to pay for this by increasing the capital gains tax from 50% inclusion to 66% for corporations on any capital gain. And they'll do that the same for any individual making $250,000 in capital gains. That's going to really hit businesses, business owners, small, medium, large. They're just going to stop investing in Canada because the reward won't be there. They claim it's going to bring in $6.5 billion this year, $20 billion over the next 4 years. I don't think they're going to meet those targets, and I think it's going to really hurt the economy. This is not a budget built to get the Canadian economy back on track.
Brian, Stats Canada recently released the latest inflation number. Now, it came up slightly to 2.9%. What does that really mean when it comes to the key lending rate from the Bank of Canada? Will it remain status quo at 5%, or could we potentially see another increase?
What most of us are hoping for is a rate cut. And of course, you've got politicians across the country saying it's time for a rate cut. Like, this is hurting the housing sector. This is hurting small businesses. It's hurting people renewing their mortgages. And between the excess spending in this federal budget and this inflation rate bouncing up to 2.9%, mortgage index up at 25% year over year, rent increasing 8.5% year over year. This does not bode well. And the Bank of Canada made it clear that they need to be sure that inflation is under control before they start cutting rates again. The fact that, yeah, it's only 2.9%, but, food for restaurants, that's up 5.1%. Food that you and I buy, it's down to 1.9, but food overall is up 3%. You've got all these other key components that are still higher than where the Bank of Canada wants to see inflation before they do a rate cut. So you combine all of that with this inflationary spending that's in the budget, and I don't see them cutting the rate in June, maybe September, but that becomes a maybe at this point. I think we're in a wait and see holding pattern. I don't expect a rate increase, but don't expect that much anticipated, much desired cut to happen.
Alberta Premier Daniel Smith is looking at legislation to stop the Trudeau government from striking deals with municipalities and spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction. Now, Quebec is on Alberta's side, but Brian, not so much with Doug Ford in Ontario. Why not?
It comes down to how governments are perceived here. In different parts of the country, having lived and worked across the country, I can tell you there's a different perception of Ottawa in Quebec than in Ontario. There's a different perception in Alberta. In Alberta and Quebec, they're very similar in some ways, politically, very different in others. But when it comes to the relationship with the federal government, they're both a bit antagonistic. And the population is as well. It's not just the political leaders. And so Danielle Smith can say, we're going to do this. I wouldn't be surprised if Scott Moe does something similar. It used to be that all of the premiers would say, no, stay out of our jurisdiction. In Ontario, the consensus appears to be among voters, we don't care who does it, just do it. And they want to see all governments acting in all areas. It makes no sense to me. It would be like Doug Ford deciding, well, I'm going to increase spending on the military since Justin Trudeau won't, and I'll raise an Ontario regiment, and we'll buy helicopters and tanks. You would look at, if the Ford government tried that, or the Danielle Smith government tried that, people would look and say, that's crazy. But the Trudeau government, they're obsessed with spending in provincial jurisdiction areas. The Bloc Québécois was up on their hind legs, and rightly so, in question period earlier this week, asking about this and saying your housing plan underfunds us and it doesn't spend in the areas that we want. You need to stay out of Quebec's jurisdiction. The Legault government feels much the same way, but there are certain areas of the country, I would say Manitoba, Ontario, parts of Atlantic Canada, where, okay, spend it on provincial jurisdiction. We don't know the difference and we don't really care, is kind of the ethos.
Yeah, you know, Alberta Premier Daniel Smith keeps telling Justin Trudeau, stay in your lane. That seems to be a common theme here in the province. Now, the Trudeau government, Brian, rebranded the carbon tax rebate, which is going out to various Canadian households. I'm still waiting to get mine here. Now, you say they're fighting with banks over how it's being described in our online statements. Tell me more.
Yeah, you pull up your bank statement on your phone or your computer, and you'll see debits and credits. And I don't know about you, but my bank, I sometimes look at something that went out of the account, and I say, "Well, what's that?" Or something comes in, and okay, I'm not sure. They don't have the best system for labeling everything, and the Trudeau government's frustrated that when the carbon tax or Canadian carbon rebate, I think is what they're calling it, when it shows up, they want that to be what shows up on the line because they want it for marketing purposes. They want you to feel good about the carbon tax, and not many Canadians do right now, let me tell you. And so some of the banks have said, yes, we'll do it. Others are saying it's going to take a while, and others are saying, we don't have to do this for you. It really is the federal government trying to use the banks as part of their marketing scheme. You know, Jean Chrétien was famous for sending Canadians checks, but he made sure it was checks back in the day because, well, back then we didn't have direct deposit in quite the way we do now. But also, you get a little check with the Government of Canada logo and the maple leaf showing up, and you're like, oh, money from the government, and you feel good about the government. It worked for him. Trudeau's hoping that the carbon tax rebate works that way for him, and so far it's not. And part of it is it shows up in your account, and people look at their phone and say, "Oh, we got $180. I don't know what that's for. Okay, let's spend it."
Brian, there's word now that NDP leader Jagmeet Singh may no longer be in full support of the carbon tax, especially when it comes to the levy being added to our natural gas bills. He's more in support, I guess, of commercial enterprises. Could he potentially pull his support on the coalition with the Liberals that we may see a non-confidence vote and potentially head to the polls sooner than October of next year?
I don't think so for a moment. Look, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP voted for the Conservative motion demanding that the Prime Minister hold a First Minister's meeting, televised First Minister's meeting on the issue of the carbon tax. They did that because they're getting pressure from their own voters who aren't happy with the carbon tax. You've got premiers like Wab Kinew in Manitoba who want rid of the carbon tax, and he's a New Democrat. And so they're feeling a bit of the pinch. So they voted for that. And then there was a couple of stories saying, oh, they're walking away from support of the carbon tax. And Jagmeet Singh quickly ran to the microphones to say, oh, no, we're still all in favor of it. The NDP, look, said earlier, you know, a budget written in orange ink. That's what this Trudeau budget is. It's written in orange ink. They have given the NDP what they wanted. Why would he pull the plug? I'm starting to wonder if Jagmeet Singh's not the real prime minister and Justin Trudeau is the figurehead. You know, I'm only partly joking at that point. But the NDP, this is as good as it's going to get for them, despite the fact that the Liberal support is dropping and Conservatives are doing well. Normally, for the Conservatives to do well and be threatening to win an election, the NDP needs to be strong. The NDP is not strong right now, not in any poll, despite the Liberals falling apart. The Conservatives are eating all that support. It's not going to get better if Jagmeet Singh pulls the plug and goes to an election now.
Could you potentially see Jagmeet Singh losing his seat in the next federal election? Because a lot of insiders within the NDP that I talked to are not happy with the fact that he's not acting like an opposition leader.
Well, you remember a week or so ago, there were 3 New Democrat MPs that announced on the same day that they wouldn't be running in the next election. So Carol Hughes, Rachel Blaney, Charlie Angus all said on the same day they're not running. That followed 3 other New Democrats who said they're not running in the next election. When your caucus is that small and 6 say they're not running, you've got to imagine that there are problems in the caucus. And part of it is there was a big caucus meeting before those three announced about how close they are to the Liberals, that it's not helping them, that Jagmeet Singh is going out there denouncing the Liberal government on a daily basis, saying how awful they are, and then turning around and propping them up and voting for them. And it's annoying a lot of New Democrat voters who say that they are too close to the Liberals. And, if you talk to dippers, what's their big slogan? Liberal Tory, same old story. They see Justin Trudeau as if he's Pierre Poilievre. And you and I look at Justin Trudeau and say he's going to the left of the New Democrats. It's not helping the NDP. So I could see Singh losing his seat absolutely, and I could also see the NDP losing far more than just his seat, but many seats across the country. We'll have to wait until a campaign comes along. My three sayings about politics: voters are fickle, polls can change, campaigns matter.
That's very true. Brian, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently testified at the Foreign Interference Inquiry. Now, you wrote that he was saying one thing under oath and another when questioned by the media. Can you explain?
So there were two big things that came out of his testimony. One was he doesn't read his national security briefings. He was asked several times about different briefings. He was asked about details in memos that were sent to him, and he would say, "Well, I didn't read that." Well, why not? I prefer verbal briefings. The best way to get this to me is to have someone tell me what's happening. Don't send me a memo I may not have the time to read, he said. Multiple times this came up. And then when he was asked about that by a reporter on Friday, they said, "Are you going to start reading your briefing notes now?" He said, "I read everything." Well, what is it? You either don't read, which you testified to under oath, or you read everything, which is what you're saying when the cameras are rolling, when the media is there. It can't be both. And yet he wants you to believe it is both. And the other thing was, he said he undermined CSIS repeatedly. He talked about how their evidence wasn't credible. You couldn't take what they said at face value, that you had to interpret all of these things. And then again, asked by the media, "Do you have faith in CSIS?" "Oh, I have absolute trust and faith in CSIS." You can't spend your whole time undermining them and then say you have faith in them. But his two objectives going into testifying: one, give himself plausible deniability. Deny that you saw these things, deny that anyone told them to you, therefore you didn't have to act. Two, undermine CSIS as a credible source. And he accomplished both of those.
Following Iran's attack on Israel this past weekend, there are renewed calls to name Iran's Revolutionary Guard or the Islamic Republic a terrorist entity. Brian, is Ottawa any closer to doing that?
They've been under pressure to do this for years. And as recently as January, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was saying, "We're actively examining it." Well, I don't know how long you need to actively examine it. We are now in mid-April. Over the weekend, it was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that launched these attacks against Israel. We know that they have been funding Hezbollah. Iran says that their strike on Israel was in retaliation for Israel taking out a top general who's the Hezbollah liaison, who was meeting with them in Syria to plot the attacks of Hezbollah from Lebanon into Israel. We know that Iran funded and trained Hamas for the attacks on October 7th. We know that they fund terrorism around the world, and yet the Trudeau government won't do it. Now, they claim there's a portion of the Revolutionary Guard Corps where there's conscription, and they don't want to get people who are just forced to serve labeled as terrorists. You can still label the organization a terrorist entity. You can still impose greater sanctions, but they seem incredibly reluctant to do so, and I don't understand it. But I'm puzzled by a lot of the Trudeau foreign policy, an arms embargo against Israel at a time when it needs arms to defend itself. Melanie Joly telling Israel, "Take the win," over the attack on the weekend, meaning they didn't hit that many things. So just don't retaliate against a country that just launched hundreds and hundreds of UAVs and drones and missiles into your territory. These guys puzzle me to no end how.
So, Brian, let me ask you something. Where does the Trudeau government stand when it comes to support for Israel right now?
I, just Lick your finger, stick it up in the air, wherever the wind is blowing, but it's not with Israel. I rolled my eyes when I saw Justin Trudeau put out a statement on the weekend saying, we stand with Israel. No, no, you do not. I think the Canadian people do, but I do not think that Trudeau does. There's a great piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day. They saw the actual original communique from the G7 leaders who met on the weekend discussing Iran's attack, and they compared it to what came out. And it was a severely watered down statement compared to what the Biden administration had wanted to put out. And the reason is, according to the Wall Street Journal, Canada and Japan helped water it down. They said, oh no, you can't be so strident in your support for Israel. You can't condemn Iran that strongly. This, again, I don't know where this government is going, except basically you have to look at diaspora politics, and you have to look at where are large crowds gathering that the Trudeau government hopes to get votes for. Well, a lot of that are the people who are cheering on Iran, as we saw happen in Toronto. Right after the attacks happened, there were cheers that went up in the crowds of the pro-Hamas protesters that were out in the streets. There were people pledging allegiance to Hamas in Montreal just the other day. Trudeau's hoping for votes from these areas, and so he doesn't want to be too strong. It's really disheartening.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hal.